Hello, I'm Elizabeth. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome for the first time if you're new. I like to read books, I like to make vlogs, I like to do fun things. And today I'm doing a collab with some other great YouTubers where we read the 10 books from 10 years of Goodreads Choice Award winners. Number 1, to see if they deserve to win. Number 2, to share our opinions. This challenge was created by beautifully bookish Bethany and Isabel from the channel Happy for Now. My friend from Instagram, Alex from Pucks and Paperbacks, asked me if I would be interested in reading history and biography, and I said yes. But do I regret it? No, I don't regret it. I did learn a lot by reading a lot of history and a lot of biographies. When I was first asked to do this challenge, I was told it was vlog style, but I forgot it was a vlog, so I just started reading the books, and then I realized I was supposed to be vlogging. But I did not vlog any. Number 1, because my camera was broken, and I just got a new camera, so it was really hard to vlog without a working camera. And number 2, the entire month of January, I didn't have any of my Ritalin because of the Adderall shortage. So it was really extremely hard to focus long enough to remember to vlog. And by the time I would think about it, I would be either in bed or at work, and we cannot vlog either in bed or at work. So I didn't really get to vlog much of this, but I still read a lot of books, so I thought I would review them. I decided to sit down and read. I decided to sit down and do my makeup and share my thoughts on 10 years of the Goodreads Choice Award winners. So without further ado, here we go. Here's my thoughts on all of these books and words and pages. There were too many. The very first winner was 2011's Steve Jobs. And my question is, did this win because it was Steve Jobs or because it was a well-written biography? I personally think it's just because it was Steve Jobs and because he died October 5th, 2011, and the memoir was published and won the Goodreads Choice Awards in 2011. I think it was because the man had just recently passed away, and therefore a lot of people had a lot of, feels about the man who created Apple dying, and they wanted to remember him in a way. Do I think the memoir deserved to win? No. And I say that because I read 40% of it and I was bored. Some memoirs don't need to be memoirs. I think we can learn about Steve Jobs without reading the minutia of his life, of his parents' lives, of the lives around him. When you have a 3-page foreword at the front of the book that lists everyone in your book that is mentioned and how he is connected to Steve Jobs, I just think that means that you're not a great writer, because you should be able to narrow down the characters of a person's life, and we should be able to understand who's important and remember them without having to go look at the forward of the book and remember the thesaurus of people who were connected to Steve Jobs. If you have to have a whole 3 pages listed of everybody who's ever been related to this man and why they matter to the memoir, then it's not a great written memoir, and I just could not force myself to keep reading it. I read 40% of it. I was reading it on my Kindle. If I had been listening to it on audiobook, I don't even think I would have gotten 20% in. And I think he's an interesting man, but I think this novel memoir contributes to the mythology of Steve Jobs more than it contributes to the actual legacy and impact in the actual person that is Steve Jobs. It read like any memoir released the year a man dies, much more like a mythical retelling of his life than with a lot of weird Wikipedia level minutia than actual reckoning with the legacy of Steve Jobs and his impact and how he interacted with the world. 2012, we are continuing with our theme of very boring memoirs with biography of Queen Elizabeth II. Okay, Number 1, I could understand if this book would have been published this year and it winning, but I don't understand, like within the last year of the Queen dying, but I don't understand a book that was published when the Queen was still alive, why it won the nonfiction award, because it is boring. And I tried to read it, I really did. I got over, I would say 30% in, and I just could not keep reading it. I was reading it on my Kindle, another one of those books you could not listen to, like the narration would be so devastatingly boring. But even on my Kindle, it was incredibly difficult to read. Just the way it told little stories about the Queen, it would say, like, it would basically do like little anecdotes about her life, and I really did not need to hear everyone's little story about the time they interacted with Prince Philip or Queen Elizabeth. Like, I did not need that, especially when it was talking about how Prince Philip used to talk about her shapely legs to his friends. I did not need to know that Prince Philip was talking about her that way. Basically, if you want to learn more about Queen Elizabeth, why? And to just watch The Crown. You'll at least be entertained. 2013, Jim Henson, the biography. I'm actually still in the middle of reading this. I was listening to the audiobook and I was trying to finish it. I really was. And I think I got 40% of the way into the audiobook. And let me tell you, this audiobook is a struggle, like majorly struggling of an audiobook to listen to. It's just really, really dull. Mainly the narrator is really boring. But I really am interested in Jim Henson's life because he created the Muppets, and I really think what an interesting character. I would love to learn more about him, but the audiobook is boring. I will say that I did get the Kindle just a few hours ago, literally overnight, right before I was going to film this, and I thought, I really wish I literally requested this at the library a couple times, and then I was in the middle of reading other things, or I didn't get to it before the hold ran out, so I finally got the book, borrowed the book from the library on Kindle, and maybe I'll finish reading it and it can be in my February books that I read. Because I really am interested in Jim Henson, but I will say the writing reads like a very detailed Wikipedia page. Even if I'm interested in the person that the writer is writing about, I wish they wrote about them in a more interesting way, and it wasn't just details, and the storyline of who Jim Henson is like dragged down in the minutia of details. It's just boring. 2014, The Romanov Sisters, and this is where we come to a book that I didn't even get to start reading. Why didn't I get to start reading it? Well, it was only available via audiobook from the library, and I am very, very aware of the Romanov family. They were like my hyperfixation in high school. So yes, I was going to listen to the audiobook, but I started it and I could not listen to this in audio. It's too, like, even sped up, it was just not something I could listen to. If they had had the Kindle book available at my library, I might have been able to read this one, but they did not have the Kindle book available, and I'm just super aware of the Romanovs and their place in history and the Romanov sisters. Like, I had a hyperfixation obsession with all of them, like Anastasia, Tatiana, Maria. Like, I loved them as a kid, and I was one of those children who understood that Anastasia did not survive their demise. So it wasn't because I like romanticized them in any way. It was literally because I was obsessed with sad, tragic moments in history, like Anastasia's death and Marie Antoinette's death. Anyway, I don't understand why this book won the nonfiction of the year book, because is it just because they're royals? Like, there's nothing new or life-changing about this kind of book. It doesn't give you new information that changes the way that you view the world. Learning about royalty who were executed is just not that engaging of nonfiction to me. And it's really hard for me to invest in learning more about people who have no impact on my life today. If it was a novel about, or a nonfiction story about the Russian Revolution, yes, I love reading nonfictions about overarching narratives in history that impact us today. Reading about individual royals, I don't understand why that wins the Goodreads Choice Awards. I don't understand. It's like the novel about, or the nonfiction book about Queen Elizabeth. She's a queen. Is that why she won? Like, I don't get it. Okay, 2015's book is a book that I actually had read before, so yay to me, and it is Dead Wake, and it is a story about the Lusitania, the moments, the decisions that led up to it being sunk by the Germans, which led to the US's entrance into World War I. I love this book. It reads like a crime thriller because you know the end, you know the ship is going to sink, you know the Germans are going to torpedo it. But at the same time, you are hooked by the interconnected lives of everyone on board as they live their final moments and the history of that. This is the kind of nonfiction book that I eat up like candy. It's so good, and I cannot put it down, and it's one of the nonfiction books I always recommend. If you like to read nonfiction, Erik Larson's nonfiction books are simply some of the very best in the biz, and I always recommend Erik Larson as a writer. He's just absolutely engaging and writes some of the best nonfiction out there. Okay, now the winner of the 2016 nonfiction books was Leonard by William Shatner, and I got this book on Kindle, and I started it and I realized I didn't know who these people were because I have never watched William Shatner or any of his shows. I still don't know who Leonard is, but the subtitle is My 50-Year Friendship with a Remarkable Man. And I'm sorry, if I don't know either of you, I don't think I would be interested in reading about your friendship. So yes, I started it and then got distracted because then I started reading the 2017 book, and the 2017 book is my favorite book on this list. So you could tell that I was not going back to the 2016 book once I started the 2017 book. And yes, I was trying to read these books in chronological order because when you have to read 10 nonfiction books, you've got to start somewhere. And for me, it was really overwhelming to try to read these nonfiction books, especially since they were not all available on Kindle or audiobook from my library. Let's talk about the 2017 book, Radium Girls. Now, I started listening to this book on audio, and honestly, it was not compelling on audiobook at all. I was a little bit lost, I was a little bit bored, so then I thought, well, let me give it a chance on Kindle, and I could not put it down. I ate this book up. I literally ate it up. It was so good, so compelling, my favorite book on this list. This book is about the girls who painted radium on radium watches and tools that the government needed during World War I, and then it became like cottagecore industry where people wanted radium on everything because it glowed in the dark. And they would put the paint brushes in their mouths and like lick them and then dip them in the radium. And then I think sometimes I kind of got confused about the lip and point method, like how exactly it worked. Basically, they were consuming radium while they worked. And of course, there was no personal protective equipment because even though radium is deadly, they didn't realize that it was, so they weren't wearing proper protective gear. So even if they weren't sticking the paint literally in their mouth, they still would have gotten poisoned by the radium. But the first signs that they were being poisoned by radium was the sad, sad fact that their jawbones literally started falling out. And that gave me nightmares. Like this one girl goes to the dentist and he literally like is in her mouth trying to fix her mouth, and parts of her jawbone come out. And they literally have no idea where it's going. All the doctors are confused. They don't know why these girls' bones are like decaying rapidly at 21, 22 years old. And it was a horrifying story. And of course, the company that owned the radium factories did not want to compensate the girls' families. They didn't want to pay their medical bills. So their poor parents were going bankrupt, and their husbands were going bankrupt, trying to save their daughters and their wives' lives. They were literally losing everything. Nobody's listening. The companies are blaming the girls and saying, oh, they have syphilis, or they have, they weren't doing their job properly, and just like different BS excuses to not help these poor people out, these poor women. And there were several hundred of them, and they had lifelong medical problems. Many of them died within 2 or 3 years from working at these radium factories. That was probably the hardest part, was how deadly it was. It was a deadly cancer type of thing that killed them because it was radiation exposure. Anyway, the government incompetence, the company's incompetence, the refusal of these companies to own up to doing wrong was absolutely horrific. It read like a thriller in the worst kind of horror sort of way. And everyone who went to work at these factories had families, had loved ones, had a full life, and you really got to know their whole lives, not just the radium that consumed them. And in getting to know them, you develop such a love for these real people and their real stories. And it was really, really, really upsetting to read about the deaths of so many of these people and the way they fought this company tooth and nail to pay for their medical equipment and to own up to endangering their lives. And this company just refused to cooperate. And it wasn't just government incompetence. It was literally like corporate greed combined with the government. Anyway, it made me angry, and it is part of the reason I didn't read any books for a few days after. I would say at least a week. It was really, really hard for me to pick up another book after reading that, because it sat with you in such a heavy, heavy way that I really struggled to think of anything. I was just thinking about those poor girls and their jawbones that fell out. It was body horror in the worst kind of way, because it was 100% based on real life experiences and facts. The next book, I actually did not read this year. I read this last year. I think I read this in 2021. It's called The Good Neighbor, and is about Mr. Roger. I listened to the whole audiobook in 2021. and I think it was 2022 or 2021. So I was really thankful. I'd already read it, so I didn't have to read it today. I'm also going to look at my camera on my phone to put on my eyeliner instead of looking at you. So what did I think of The Good Neighbor about Mr. Rogers? I think I reviewed this when I read it, but I'm going to review it again here because it did win the Goodreads Choice Awards, and honestly, I was surprised. I literally thought when I saw it won, I was like, was there no other books here in the nonfiction section that were more interesting? It read like a long Wikipedia page. If you're wondering if I like reading Wikipedia pages as books, the answer is no, I don't. And then when you compare it to a book like Radium Girls that kept you on the edge of your seat the whole time, you've got to wonder why mediocre nonfiction biographies win. I just don't like biographies winning. Biographies are rarely winning nonfiction to me. To me, it needs to be a story that you don't know the end. Whereas a person like Mr. Rogers or Queen Elizabeth or the Romanov Sisters, you know their end. You know their beginning, middle, and end. You can go look it up on Wikipedia yourself. You don't need to read a 500-page book on their life to understand who they are. There needs to be some other angle to the memoir. Their impact, their story, something new. You know, a new idea that needs to, or someone that's so little known that writing a memoir about them is groundbreaking. Like, I don't know. That's my opinion. That is my opinion on memoirs. I just don't like reading them as much as I like reading a story from history that is true, like Radium Girls, or this next book that won in 2019, The Five. It's kind of like 5 little memoirs about the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper. Now, some people have an obsession with Jack the Ripper. I do not. I've never really been interested in that time in history. I had mistakenly believed, like many people, that the women who Jack the Ripper were killed were targeted for their occupation, that they worked in sex work. That is what I understood, but this book really dives into their lives, their families, and who they actually were behind the headlines, and I thought it did a fantastic job. I had to read it really fast, so I don't really have a lot of words to say. I was really just trying to finish this list as much as I could, and I thought it was great. I thought it was well written. I understand why it won the 2019 awards, and I would recommend it as a nice nonfiction if you are interested in that period of history or learning about the women from history who often are overlooked in the way we talk about history. Because I've heard about Jack the Ripper a lot, but I've never really heard about his victims other than the salacious kind of stories they told about who they were or their work they did, which in many cases is not actually true based on this story in like an investigation into his actual victims. And they had they were not just headlines, I will say. And this book does a great job of explaining that they weren't just headlines, they were real people with full 3D lives, and the way they died should not be the only way that we remember them. 2020, great book. This is probably my second favorite book on this list, and it is Case: The Origins of Our Discontent. This book compares the case systems in countries like India, the case systems that the Nazis implemented in Germany, starting in the Nuremberg laws in 1933, and the way our racial injustices in the United States are very much a case-like system. I thought this book was very compelling. It was over 400 pages though, so it was a very long read. It took me quite a bit of time, which is why I hurried through the book about Jack the Ripper or the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper, because I knew I had this book coming up and I knew it was going to take me quite a few days to read it. I ended up reading the Kindle version of it, and I'm glad I did. I don't think I could have listened to this on audiobook. It was a little complicated and read like an academic text in a good way. It had a lot of really interesting anecdotes that backed up the idea or the thesis that racial injustice in the United States is a case system and not just a racist system. I thought it was really fascinating. And I kind of agreed with the author by the end. I agreed with her. It also had a lot of interesting history I didn't know about, like Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to India, or how Jewish people in Germany related to Black Americans in the US, and vice versa, and just a lot of really interesting history of inequality around the world and the way that the Germans pulled from American racial inequality that was built into our law to create inequality in their law. If you've read books like White Fragility or other anti-racist books, I think this is a great book that will show you that it's not just an American problem, that inequality built into the legal system has existed around the world, and it takes more than just acknowledging that it's built into the legal system to understand how caste weaves its way into every aspect of our relationship with society, and especially from the persons who are unjustly treated by caste systems, and how they're much harder to overcome than just changing the law, that it's a cultural thing and not just a legal change. Anyway, I found this book to be incredibly interesting. It was not slow or dull to read. It was very, very fascinating in a good way. Now, moving on to the 10th book, 2021's Empire of Pain. I have tried to read this book 3 different times. It is on my bookshelf. I actually own a hard copy of it. I have tried to listen to the audiobook. Not made for me. I've tried to read the hardback, and I've gotten 30% of the way in. Maybe I will eventually get a Kindle copy and be able to read it. But right now, I'm still struggling my way through it. It is the story of the family behind much of the fentanyl crisis and Oxycontin and the development of medicines that are much more addictive, and how that impacts the fentanyl crisis in the United States. The Sackler family is terrible. That's basically the moral of the story. So it's just reading about terrible people and their terrible accumulation of wealth, because they are extremely wealthy and they have finagled their way through the US legal system in order to not take accountability for the way that they have gotten doctors to overprescribe opioids in order to make a profit while ignoring the dangers of addiction. So it's a good book. I just really struggled to read it. It's just really dull to me. Reading about a family figuring out how to be bad is not... It should be more interesting than the way it is written. I will say it is a very slow book, and I think that is why I'm struggling to read it. It's just very, very slow, especially since we are currently living through this family's real life history as it impacts us today. Hope you enjoyed watching that. I had a lot of fun putting my thoughts together. I cannot say I had as much fun reading these. I did stress out a lot because I didn't finish all the books, as I mentioned in the video. I was really stressed about that, but I did the best I could with the brain power I was given in this world, and I could only force myself to read so much nonfiction in 1 month, because did I procrastinate to the last minute to read these books? Yes, I did. But we're not going to mention that. Anyway, other people had a great time. Maybe I did not, but other people had a great time. So I'm going to link the playlist below for all the other folks in this collaboration. There's some great readers, some great YouTubers and booktubers who read these books and shared their thoughts, and y'all should go watch them. So I'm going to link them below and go check them out. If any of my reactions surprised you, I would love to hear about it, because I love chatting about nonfiction, and I do like chatting about the books I've read. So let me know in the comments, and be sure to check me out on Patreon and Instagram, and I will see y'all later. See ya.
We're sorry. You have reached a number that has been disconnected or is no longer in service.